I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education. I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. We encourage all our participants located in the Bay Area to pay their Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. Speaking of the chat, it will be disabled for these calls except for us to share information with the audience. If you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try our best to answer them in the time we have today. In that same toolbar, you can find the CC button to enable closed captioning. We're also grateful to have ASL interpreters on hand throughout the call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. This week, our attention has turned to Rafah, the city at the southernmost tip of Gaza near the border with Egypt, where those fleeing the relentless bombing of the Israeli military have been pushed to the brink. There are more than 1.4 million Palestinians estimated to be in Rafah, an area of only about 25 square miles. That makes it one of, if not the most densely populated places on Earth. And Israel is currently bombing refugees there with no place to go. While Samar and Max Elbaum identified some of the indicators that a ceasefire was becoming more probable, there are also historical examples which warn us that the final stages of a period of ethnic cleansing are moments in which the perpetrators of these atrocities accelerate mass destruction and death. The current conditions in Rafah, a place with a harrowing history of massacres and forced displacement of Palestinians, have raised alarms for everyone and resulted in increased direct actions throughout this week and a call for more through this weekend and into next. We hope you continue to join those mobilizations and hope that the analysis we share today will guide organizations and individuals working in solidarity with Palestine towards a shared analysis and strategy for the urgent moment we find ourselves in yet again. Today's agenda, let me share my screen. Today's agenda is as follows. First, Melissa Fan will lead us in a somatics grounding practice. These practices are intended to help us all acknowledge the ongoing trauma that is affecting our communities, harness our focus, and build resiliency in our minds and bodies to sustain our work. Next, Samar Arabi from AROC will share analysis and updates on political developments internationally and in the US. Finally, this week I'll be joined by Ariel Koren and Rami Ibrahim to talk about No Tech for Apartheid and how organizers within that coalition have undertaken the fight to end the genocide in Gaza. Thanks for joining us today. Please continue your efforts to stop this genocide and free Palestine. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Hey everyone. Hey Thomas, can you stop? Okay, there you go. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. As Thomas mentioned, this past week we saw an escalation in the genocide in Palestine with the beginnings of the siege on Rafah. Every single week there are new and increasing stories of horror to witness, and it doesn't get easier. In fact, it weighs heavier and heavier with each passing day. If you are struggling to hold it all, please know that you are not alone. That is the response of a functioning and feeling heart. I struggle to express the psychological whiplash that we experienced watching the siege on Rafah happen simultaneous to watching the spectacle that is the Super Bowl, where millionaires and billionaires all colluded to distract and detract from the genocide they are implicated and complicit in. It's clear that we are in a time of intensifying contradictions. How do we hold the contradictions? How do we continue to hold the despair, the horror, the rage, and the grief? We do it through community, through grounding in the fact that we are not alone, that we are all here together, oriented toward justice and liberation. Right now, there are 183 people in this call. I know that we can't see each other, but we are here. So take a moment to just imagine being in a room with 183 people. It's hard to feel a sense of community when we are all virtual, but this community exists. We are all here occupying the same time, if not the same space, hearing the call for a free Palestine. And outside of this particular space, there are millions in the world who are fighting together for a ceasefire, for a freed Palestine. So for our somatics grounding today, let us ground in our collective body. Take a moment to get into a comfortable position. You can be standing, sitting, laying down, and begin to take a notice of your breathing. Simply observe if your breathing is fast or slow, shallow or deep. Notice if you're breathing into your lungs and your chest, or if your breath is extending all the way to the bottom of your diaphragm and your belly. And as you are noticing your breath, begin to think about just one person in your life who is in this fight with you. Shantae's screen is like giving off some fireworks. Yes. And now that there are 190 people in this space together, imagine once again just being in a room with 190 different people and feeling and grounding in the fact that all of us here are looking for ways that we can contribute our unique skills, time, energy, resources to fighting for ceasefire and for a free Palestine. And as you remain connected to your breath, I want you to zoom out a little bit more. So we have 194 people here now. Now zooming out just to the city that you live in. Knowing that in cities all across the world, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are tuning in, who can see the injustice, and who desperately want liberation for Palestine and beyond. And know that we can hold this together. We can hold the contradictions. We can hold the grief. We can hold the horror. And we are creative people. I believe in us. And there are so many of us who are in this fight together. Please remember to borrow the collective body, to ground in the collective body. We are not alone in this, and you do not have to hold it alone. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thank you so much, as always, for grounding us and getting us oriented towards our resiliency over the long haul. So we're now going to be joined by Samar Arabi from Iraq to share some analysis of key developments. Samar, I know that every week we come on and say there's a lot that happened this week, but in particular, given what's happening right now in Rafah and the political developments that have happened with regard to uh, some of the bills that have come across the House. I know there's a lot to catch us up on, so we're grateful to have you again this week, and looking forward to what you have to share.
Thanks so much, Thomas. It's a real honor to be here. Yeah, this feels very much like a pivotal week. Last week we spoke a little bit about how it's a little bit impossible to read the tea leaves. So it's hard to fully know, what's coming, what sort of horrors lie ahead. But this Rafah operation really does feel like a seminal moment of this entire, genocide campaign. So I did want to spend a good amount of my time today specifically going through what's happening in Rafah, and then zoom out a little bit to talk about the kind of broader political developments, particularly here in the US with the aid to Israel bill, and then some updates about what's been happening on the ground in the Bay Area to sort of push back on a lot of this stuff. So just jumping right into the situation in Rafah, the campaign as it's been going, Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign, which is now in its fifth month, has sort of successively pushed downwards from northern Gaza all the way down to Rafah, which is the southernmost point of the Gaza Strip on its border with Egypt, which is not to say that atrocities have been happening in Rafah since day one, right? Where they've been telling Palestinians to move down there, but have been bombing them consistently from the beginning. The difference is that now the concerted military effort is specifically in Rafah, this tiny area at the very bottom of the Gaza Strip, where over, I think, 1.5 million Palestinians are now crammed into one of the Gaza Strip was already one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and that has now been confined into a very tiny strip right on the border with Egypt. It has already been a horror in Rafah just in this past week that Israel has spoken about how it's making it its new priority. There's an ongoing campaign at the last semi-functioning hospital in Gaza, which is in Rafah, where snipers are shooting at everybody who's going in or out of that hospital, and a number of patients have already died from power blackouts there. There's a lot to say about all the terrible things that have already happened, including the bonkers hostage rescue that happened on the day of the Super Bowl, which resulted in just under 100 people being killed as a distraction, which produced the first, I guess, over the past 4 months, Israel has released one hostage through these sort of military efforts, and now that number has gone up to 3 probably. So this move up to get 2 more hostages required 100 innocent people to be killed as a distraction. The sort of perception of what's happening, sorry, that jumped ahead a little bit. The perception of what's happening in Rafah, I think the way it's being handled in the quote unquote international community is seeing a real shift, I think, in a way that's really important. First of all, despite the IDF's continuing assertions that that Rafah is the last bastion of Hamas, that doesn't really seem to be bearing out in any sort of way. No meaningful evidence has been provided to that effect. There's still a very clear indication that Hamas presence is actually quite strong in the rest of the Gaza Strip. So nothing about that argument makes sense, and I don't think anyone is buying it. There's a lot of pressure on Israel to stop this offensive, given that Palestinians in Rafah have nowhere to go, so that even like the sort of fiction of moving civilians out so they could attack Hamas can't really exist in this really kind of confined space. I thought that this NBC News article described it well, which is Biden disparages Netanyahu in private, but hasn't significantly changed U.S. policy towards Israel and Gaza. So there's pressure, and European leaders, along with the United States and the UN, are putting a lot of pressure on Israel to not do this, but it's not super clear yet whether or not that's going to play out. So like Rafah really feels like a sort of end game in this process. There's been a lot of talk for the Israeli military to be concluding its main operations before Ramadan starts, which is in 3 weeks. And so the big question is what that sort of big final push will end up looking like. Thomas mentioned, and I think this is really accurate, that it's often the case that before a final agreement is negotiated is often when violence is worse. So it's hard to know whether a final agreement is coming now or soon, and it's hard to know how much of this Rafah saber rattling is performative versus the sort of beginnings of, in spite of all of the reasons that it's an absolutely absurd thing for them to do, maybe they are about to go full throttle ahead. It's really, really hard to say. One thing that people have been talking a lot about lately is the question of displacing Palestinians from Rafah into Egypt. And, this is something that the Israeli government had been openly pushing for since October 8th. So it's not a big surprise that that's something that continues to be a concern, particularly given the past few days, Egypt has started this sort of mysterious construction project right over the border, where they've flattened out, I think, already 5 square kilometers with the plan to make about 20 square kilometers of area, and they're bringing in tents, which all sounds a lot like a process to displace Palestinians out of Palestine and into Egypt, which has been a red line for Egypt and obviously for Palestinians themselves. But the existence of this mysterious construction now is raising questions about whether or not that is in fact going to be happening. As always, we share these slides after the PSAs, and I'd encourage you to read the one on the right, what would make Egypt open its border to Palestinians. I think that article did a good job of going through some of the considerations that Egypt has in making these decisions. But as much as I try to put these presentations together in advance, things are moving so fast. And like just this past hour, there's the Israeli defense minister, along with Netanyahu, the prime minister, have both released statements saying that Gazans will not be forced to go into Egypt. And it would be really odd for them to do that and then push them in. Like, why would they shoot themselves in the foot that way? So it appears to not be the case, and this is a really, really good development, that Gazans will be pushed out into Egypt. And to be clear, it's something that the Israelis have wanted for 5 months. I mean, they've wanted it forever to push Palestinians out of Palestine, but there has been a concerted effort to really ethnically cleanse the Palestinians out of Gaza. And the fact that they've committed to not doing it, I think, is showing that pressure to force them not to has actually been quite effective. And that's a really good sign. Nevertheless, Egypt, which receives $1 billion a year in US assistance, because of its peace treaty with Israel, right, continues to sort of cooperate with broader Israeli genocidal actions generally. So, the fact that they've pushed back on this is something, but it's not everything. And it does continue to raise questions about what that mysterious construction is. Maybe it's a forward operating post for the Egyptian military. It's really hard to know at this moment, but I think we'll know very soon, one way or another. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the scope of this pressure on Israel to stop its Rafah campaign. It's a bit unprecedented. There have been surprisingly strong statements from the US, Britain, France, even Germany, which is calling an attack on Rafah a humanitarian catastrophe, despite the fact that Germany is sending unprecedented levels of weapons shipments to Israel right now. And that the ICJ is starting this week a new investigation into the 57-year Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This is in addition to the genocide rulings that came separately. This is a whole new investigation that's happening. But also, just today, the ICJ, in its genocide ruling, put out a statement about what's happening in Rafah, saying that that recent developments in Rafah would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare, but also neglected to demand any additional provisional measures. So they said, like, our original ruling to stop committing genocide covers what's happening. So a little bit frustrating that the ICJ didn't do more, but again, it just shows the sort of, like, to the extent that the international community has ever been united on this, they are united now, which is not nothing. The other thing that I wanted to spend a bit of time on today was this Israel military assistance bill that has been sort of floundering its way through Congress for the past couple of months now. And those of you who attended last week know the way that the original bill sort of fell apart, and attempts for a special bill that specifically gave aid to Israel without the stuff happening in Ukraine and the border also failed. Again, largely as a result of pressure to not do that. So after the original Ukraine, Israel, and border bill failed, and then after the special Israel bill failed, the Senate now has advanced a new bill that cuts the amount of aid going to Israel from 17 billion to 14 billion, which is a meaningful difference, but like 14 billion is a lot. And that bill also bans funding for UNRWA. It's a nightmare of a sort of omnibus, like the different things that it's funding really come together in a way that's really horrifying. It does contain humanitarian provisions for Gaza and other places in the world, but it increases the rules and regulations and sort of observation of how that money is spent, while simultaneously decreasing the amount of accountability and transparency of the aid it's giving to Israel. So it explicitly says that that the bill doesn't require any like special notifications on how the money going to Israel is going. Like, they carve out an exception for that, which, again, absurd. So that bill has passed the Senate. It doesn't seem likely to pass the House. Republicans there don't want to provide aid to Ukraine. They have no problem giving military aid to Israel, but it's the Ukraine part that's killing the bill because of hard right Republicans in the House. So Republicans put forth their own bill that does not contain any humanitarian assistance, and like even harsher rules about what's happening to like Palestinians and other social programs. But there are attempts to try to figure out a way to do a workaround, like to go around the Speaker of the House and get the Senate bill passed. It's not really clear what's going to happen with this, but we do know that nothing will happen with it for at least another 2 weeks, because the House is now on recess. So Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who did not want to vote on this bill, has called recess. And so the House won't be meeting again until the 28th of February. So it'll be a little while before they consider anything. I just want to take a moment to note what Democrats are doing with this bill. There was a really remarkable moment where Senator Chris Van Hollen went onto the floor when they were debating this bill, saying the situation in Gaza has gone from a nightmare to pure hell, and that there would be a need to hold the Netanyahu government accountable, and that the bill would take away important needed assistance to Palestinians and would fund a off the rails right-wing government bent on the murder of Palestinian civilians. It was a very powerful speech that he gave. and then he voted for the bill that he was complaining about. So it's a really odd moment where, like, I think Democrats are recognizing that they're doing a really terrible thing, but somehow seem to continue to be doing it, which really, I think, speaks to their electoral fears and the sort of pressure that continues to need to be sustained to move them now from, before it was bad rhetoric, bad action. Now we're getting to a stage of better rhetoric and still bad action. So we need to get to good rhetoric, good action. And that pressure is having an impact. It's slow, but it is having an impact. And just to note, like, the ways that everything is related to everything else, and we always say what happens in Palestine is like indicative of the state of the world, and the ways that the walls in Palestine sort of mimic the walls that are being built elsewhere. That has never been more true than it is today, and just a note of how part of this whole negotiation around the border bill and Gaza are leading to sort of Democrats to take up that same sort of like racist and xenophobic rhetoric that Israelis have been using against Palestinians for decades to talk about what's happening on the southern border. And their like Faustian bargain, basically, to get money for Ukraine is causing them to sort of use the sort of what has historically been right-wing Republican rhetoric about the border and about like dusky people who don't make us safe. So there's a lot to say about that, but unfortunately, there was no time. So the last thing that I wanted to focus on a little bit is what's happening in sort of like the organizing and mobilization in response to all of these things and how that's moving the needle. And so one really critical piece that came out this week that I found to be really important was, some of you may remember at the beginning of the year, Biden gave a speech at the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which was widely criticized by the political establishment because, people kept interrupting him and they were like, oh, how could they do this at this church? It's really rude that people keep calling for a ceasefire while Biden is speaking here. And now a month later, that church, which was disrupted over and over again by Palestine demonstrators, that church has called for an end to all military support to Israel in a really powerful, surprisingly strong statement. And this is where, Biden was giving one of his big campaign speeches. So that really does say something. And I think it speaks to the power of that sort of direct action. There's a lot happening on increased transparency on weapon supply and weapon shipments. So even in the US, there is new reporting on how US-made arms are being used in Gaza, and then a number of countries are either reviewing or have canceled weapon shipments to Israel. Even I think the EU foreign policy chief said this quite well. He was saying, if you think too many people are being killed, maybe provide less arms, which kind of a no-brainer, but it's been taking a little while. We're starting to see that actually start to happen in an important and meaningful way. And those of you who joined last week, we talked a little bit about the economics of how that weapon shipment disruption is affecting Israel's ability to wage this ethnic cleansing campaign. This pressure is also causing Biden to start to apologize. It's way too little and way too late, but it's remarkable that we're at the point now where senior Biden administration officials sort of on the record are acknowledging that from the beginning of the conflict, this has been mismanaged. And, he's largely saying that because he's realizing it might cost him the election, but the fact that he's saying that is still meaningful. And once again, we're seeing the rhetoric shift. Now we need to get to the policy shift that goes along with it. And then I just wanted to touch on some of the big local actions that have happened just in the past few days that have been pretty remarkable. I think a big reason the international community has been so strong relatively to how they've been acting strong on Rafah is because the sort of popular movement around it has been so massive. And that's been happening everywhere in the world, but just here the folks blocked the Golden Gate Bridge a couple days ago. 300 pounds of poop were delivered to Nancy Pelosi's doorstep, which was pretty incredible. And just to say that that sort of like momentum of organizing and actions continues to sort of build to a fever pitch in a way that I do think is causing a meaningful change in discourse. So it's good to see that happening. And I think we'll talk later a little bit more about things that are upcoming and ways that you can get involved. As always, I like to close with encouraging people to get involved with the defense of children who are being prosecuted in San Francisco for standing up against the war, and to help the folks on the Bay Bridge who were arrested protesting a ceasefire, who are continuing to be prosecuted by the state. And there's a lot more to say about the March primary election. I think we'll have some space to do that probably in future sessions in a little bit today. If you do want to get involved with things that are coming up, I strongly encourage you to check out AROC's event calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. It's got almost everything that's happening, so it's a good way to stay on top of what actions you can plug into. And if you want direct information on what we're doing, just text PSA to this number, and you'll be added to AROC's text messaging system so we can keep you apprised of what's been happening and what we're up to going forward. And with that, I'll turn it back over to everybody else. Thank you so much for the time, and it's a real pleasure being here.
Thanks, Samer. I want to now welcome Ariel and Rami to talk about No Tech for Apartheid. Samer, if you could stop sharing your screen. Yeah. So No Tech for Apartheid is a campaign led by Google and Amazon workers in conjunction with over 60 civil society organizations, including AROC and the Palestinian Youth Movement, to demand an end to those companies' complicity in Israeli or settler colonial apartheid and genocidal violence against Palestinians. And specifically, the campaign has been calling for an end to Project Nimbus, a $1.2 billion contract between Google and Amazon and the Israeli government and military. Ariel is a former worker with Google and an organizer with No Tech for Apartheid, and Rami is an organizer with Palestinian Youth Movement. And I just want to welcome you both and thank you both for making time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Thomas. Honored to be here. Honored to be beside my close friend Ariel, who was the original whistleblower at Google for their $1.2 billion contract with the Israeli military. I really appreciate Samad for the grounding. Just want to reiterate that this is some of the worst conditions our people in Palestine have ever experienced. In 1948, the original displacement of our people, we saw around 750,000 Palestinians be displaced from their homelands. Tens of thousands of people were killed. And today we're seeing the forced displacement of over 2 million people. And right now, the murder and the slaughter of 35,000 Palestinians, including over 12,000 children. 1 in 10 children have not reached their first birthday who have been killed. 1 in 4 children have had amputations. And I want to uplift that in this moment, this is an intensification of the occupation of Palestine. What we're seeing in these past 4 months is the true reality of the conditions of occupation and genocide over the past 75 years. People were shutting down the Israeli consulate in 2023 before this happened. It was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank. So this genocide is really an intensification of the material conditions of living under Zionist occupation. So I just want to name how important it is to address the 16-year-long siege on Gaza, freedom for Palestinian political prisoners, and a total and complete end to the occupation. that addresses the root of the issue, which is the right of Palestinians to live freely on their land and return to their homelands. So I want to go a little bit into No Tech for Apartheid. And more specifically, I'm going to hand that part to Ariel, but I want to talk about the way that tech and AI is used on Palestinians on the ground by the Zionist occupation. So the way that we've seen it used, we have a long paper trail of documentation for how Israel uses surveillance technology to violate Palestinians' daily lives and any right to privacy that they have in both the West Bank and Jerusalem. They use this technology through biometric data tracking, so facial recognition software. They use this data that they both create in conjunction with tech companies in occupied Palestine to then imprison Palestinians. Since the beginning, before October 7th, there are about 5,000 Palestinians who were illegally imprisoned. Hundreds of children were imprisoned, and now we're seeing that number increase to 10,000 in the last 4 months. Before October 7th, we were seeing automated machine guns in Al Khalil. So using that facial recognition software that's created to literally imprison and kill Palestinians. As we know, for people of color, AI technology is racist. And you can see the ways that using AI technology for murder doesn't have the goal of specifically pinpointing and targeting people. It's used for the foundation of murdering Palestinians for the crime of being Palestinian, for the crime of living in the West Bank, for living in Gaza, for living in 1948 borders, for not committing any crime, but for being there and living in Palestine. So there's a long paper trail of the way that surveillance technology is used in the West Bank and Jerusalem. But I think there were a lot of question marks about how AI is used, especially in this particular moment. We didn't know how AI was being used during battle until now. In an article published, I want to say 2 months ago, by 972 Mag, journalists uncovered an AI system that is being used by the Zionist military called the Gospel. And this particular system generates recommendations for attacking and bombing particular places in the Gaza Strip. So in a big picture setting, companies like BlackRock finance the genocide. So they're the ones that are the financiers of the weapons industry. Companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing are the ones who create the bombs and the weapons for the mass slaughter. And then Google and Amazon and other AI tech companies are the ones that are telling the bombs where to go and who to drop them down on and who to kill. So in this moment, especially, we are seeing the use of AI creating hundreds of targets every single day generating targets at an unprecedented rate, sometimes due to the age range of a Palestinian. So there's a Palestinian in this apartment aged 18 to 35. We can suspect that they're a member of Hamas. So we're going to bomb the entire residential building and kill the hundreds of Palestinians and the families that are in that building. So AI is kind of used as an algorithmic cover and a justification of this genocide. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ariel to kind of go into the contract that Israel and Google and Amazon jointly have together.
Thanks, Rami.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rami, for providing all of that context. Yeah, I mean, as Rami mentioned, we are witnessing before our eyes the first ever AI-enabled genocide. The scale of destruction that we're witnessing would not be possible without enablement from big tech and from the AI industry. And so the No Tech for Apartheid campaign, which is a campaign that urges and that pushes big tech companies across the industry to end their complicity and their relationships with Israeli apartheid and at this point Israeli genocide is increasingly urgent. We feel that this is kind of the most urgent time that our campaign has ever known. And so I'll provide a little bit of context about kind of why we started the No Tech for Apartheid campaign. So we started it originally to target, like Rami and Thomas mentioned, Project Nimbus, which is a $1.2 billion contract between Google and Amazon and the Israeli government and military. So Google and Amazon very quietly rolled out this project in May of 2021, right in the middle of the May 2021 siege on Gaza that led to over 250 Palestinians being killed at the hands of needless Israeli military violence. So anytime, I mean, as folks who participate in BDS, who are anti-Zionist and who stand against apartheid and occupation and settler colonialism, we would obviously oppose a contract of this nature between big tech companies and the Israeli government. But the fact that they rolled it out literally in the middle of the siege on Gaza in 2021 was not a coincidence, and it was cause for exacerbated concern. So at the time, like Rami mentioned, I was in the company, I was in Google, and we were just kind of hearing the alarm bells ring, because why is Google launching this massive billion-dollar contract but not doing any press around it, not sharing publicly about the contract, which is very different from how Google normally moves when they put out a big public sector contract. Usually there's all kinds of celebration and press, and it's really public. In this case, Google was intentionally hiding the fact that they were doing this, and also not only externally not participating in press around it, but internally attempting to kind of lock down information and restrict their own workforce and people internally within the company from accessing any sort of information about the contract and the nature of the contract. So that kind of forced us to do our own investigating. And it has been something that's been extremely challenging because of the fact that Google is intentionally hiding the details about this contract and not only not being forthcoming, but actively lying about the contract. But we have learned a few things that I can kind of share. First of all, this massive billion-dollar contract comes with a clause that stipulates that Google and Amazon are bound to provide powerful tools, including data collection of civilians, tools for data collection of civilians, and other kind of really nefarious use cases to any agency within the entire Israeli ministry and government without actually having the right to regulate which agencies within the Israeli ministry and government can become beneficiaries of the tools and the contracts. So as an example, the ILA, the Israel Land Authority, is one of the primary beneficiaries of the contract. And this is the agency that's actually responsible for the expansion of illegal settlements. Another example is that the Israeli military has free reign of all of the tools that Google and Amazon are providing through this contract. And there's another clause within the contract that stipulates that in addition to having no right to regulate which agencies within Israel get to use the tools, the Google and Amazon also have no right to regulate which tools are being built out or to oversee. So there's no oversight about how the tools are getting used. So they're required to provide anything that they're asked to provide and build, but they don't get to see how it's being used on the ground. There's also a clause in the contract that explicitly states that in the event of boycott pressure, public pressure, or internal pressure from organizers within the workforce, Google and Amazon are not allowed to pull out of the contract. So it's kind of a contract that like self-insulates against organizing and activism and public pressure, which is like a really, really wild and abnormal thing to see in a large-scale billion-dollar contract between two of the most significant technology companies and, you know, like a public sector entity. Google has consistently, in response to our efforts to organize, they have consistently come out in the press denying military involvement. So Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, has consistently come out in the press and said that external activists and internal organizers from within the workforce are misrepresenting the contract, and this is not actually a contract where Google will work with the military. It's just the ministry, including civilian use cases like education and public transit, etc. However, the Israeli government itself has been putting out public statements saying that they are pleased and thrilled that the IDF now has the partnership of Google and Amazon through Project Nimbus. Also, there were leaked documents that showed the transcript of a meeting that was an onboarding meeting between Google engineers who are responsible for Project Nimbus and leaders within the Israeli military. And military officials in that meeting asked Google engineers, is it possible through Project Nimbus for Google to provide tools that will allow us to detect if someone is lying? And the engineer on the project responded, in short, yes. So all of us, not just engineers and people who work in tech, we all know that that's pseudoscience. There is no such thing as AI-enabled sentiment detection. There's no such thing as AI tools that can actually detect if someone is lying. So they're misleading and kind of, you know, telling the Israeli ministry, yes, absolutely, we can provide this capacity, because they know that that answer can be weaponized for the Israeli military to then use these tools in surveillance use cases and in detention use cases and in interrogation use cases, right? So it's just extremely concerning all around. And as a response, we've really seen the workforce within Google rise up to demand an end to this contract. We have a petition that now has over 1,000 Google workers, 1,000 Amazon workers, and a public petition that includes over 60,000 members of the general public. And in addition to that, we have had a steady drumbeat since the launch of this contract in 2021 of direct action. So in addition to the letters and the petitions in response to executives within the company actively lying to the press, and also ignoring all of the internal dissent, we have actually taken direct action. So, you know, a partnership that included the Palestinian Youth Movement and AROC and JVP and IGEN and so many other local organizing coalitions came together this past summer in 2022. Yes, summer of 2023, summer of 2023 at the Google Cloud Next conference, which is a major conference where it's kind of like the biggest cloud conference that happens in the US every year, where Google was kind of celebrating, this is our first year of profit for Google Cloud. And they were intending to celebrate that. And organizers were able to shut down the entire plaza on the first day of that conference to say, absolutely not. We will not allow for you to celebrate 1 year of profit when that profit is coming at the expense of the livelihood of Palestinian people. And then, like Rami said, that these tools are exported out of Palestine. Palestine is used as a testing ground, and these tools get employed to harm people here in the United States and all over the world. And then again in December, we had another escalation. We're going to continue to build together, and we're not going to let up. We are absolutely going to continue until we see an end to Project Nimbus. So that's kind of a summary.
Thank you both. Rami, you talked about the particular conditions we're under right now, this escalation and the acceleration, and especially given what's happening in Rafah right now. Ariel and Rami, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more. I know, Ariel, you just mentioned some of the actions you all have taken and will continue to take, but we had a question in the chat about what people can do to protest and boycott Google over Project Nimbus. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more broadly before we wrap about what are the interventions you're asking for or you're calling for, both among tech workers, since we're here in the Bay, workers generally in the Bay, and then the general public that uses, consumes, and is part of the ecosystem that supports both Google and Amazon.
Do you want me to jump in first, Rami? Yeah, I mean, like, again, this is the first AI-enabled genocide, and Rami was mentioning, like, so many of us, we think of Lockheed Martin and Boeing, but we haven't yet, like, really adjusted kind of our framework and our paradigm that AI is kind of the new frontier when we think about like weapons companies. Like, AI is scaling out the impact. Sorry, I got a message to slow down, speak a little bit slower. So we need to really reframe the way that we view our resistance. The tech industry and AI needs to be a key target. And when we look at Project Nimbus, this massive contract, this campaign to end it is not just about applying pressure onto Google and Amazon. It's about setting a precedent across the industry that if you are a part of this industry and you are engaging in this sort of massive, nefarious business with the genocidal Zionist project, you will face resistance. Your workforce will rise up against you. You will have workers threaten work stoppages and petition and go out and speak out in the press and whistleblow. And you will have members of the public shut down your buildings, protest you publicly, slam your executives on social media. We need to set a precedent that makes this not just a Google and Amazon project and problem, but across the industry. We need to normalize the idea that we will interrupt when these companies engage with the Zionist regime. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to really build that power. And it's gonna require tech workers to take bold stances and maybe, braver stances than they have before, including speaking up against their workforces, including normalizing whistleblowing and going public, including normalizing the idea of not just one worker coming out, but many, many, many workers. So we need to normalize kind of taking these bold stances. And then we also need people who aren't tech workers, because especially, and I'm going to actually pass over to Rami to talk about the significance in the Bay Area, but we also need people who aren't tech workers to take part in this, both from a direct action perspective, but also public pressure, letter writing, social media, etc. And yeah, let me pass it to Rami to kind of talk about the role we have here in the Bay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, exactly what you just said about both the tech worker component and the public component is so necessary, because we know the pay grade of tech workers. We know that a lot of them might not be willing to put their work on the line for the freedom and the dignity and the genocide of the Palestinian people. So just as much as this is a worker-led campaign, this also needs to be equally a public pressure campaign from the community, because we care about this issue just as much. And we see how this technology is used around the world. So we see it used in Palestine, and it's brought back to our communities here in the Bay Area. You're seeing the automatic license plate readers. You're seeing the AI arrests that are happening. A study came out about five of the false arrests were all Black folks because of the racist AI engineering. And our proximity here in the Bay Area, like, we are a tech hub here. Our industry is surrounded by technology and AI, and we see the way that it displaces and it gentrifies our communities here in the Bay. So we're seeing how this industry is not only pushing out our communities here in the Bay Area and creating the environment of gentrification, but we're also creating these weapons that are being used on our communities abroad and are ultimately being brought right back home. And we have a unique positionality here in the Bay Area to target these industries and to both have a public education and a direct action component. And I think it speaks to the way in which that we in the Bay Area have agency over the way that the weapons are sent. And just as much as we're targeting weapons manufacturers and Boeing and Lockheed Martin, these AI targets and these weapons companies seen through technology, seen through Google and Amazon, need to be refocused as well.
Thank you, Ariel and Rami. Before you go, can you let us know if there are tech workers who are watching or folks in the Bay who are watching, how can they plug into the campaign or get connected and educate themselves a little bit more on what you all are working on?
Yeah, if folks can reach out maybe to Thomas who have interest, and then we can kind of create a chat and follow up with anyone who's interested in plugging in, that would be great.
Great. We'll share Center for Political Education's email that you can reach me at, and then we'll share that information with Rami and Ariel. Rami and Ariel, thank you so much for sharing this analysis and for all the work you're doing. We thank you for joining us this week on the PSA.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. I just want to make a couple of announcements before we go and close out. First, as Samer mentioned, please check out AROC's event calendar and their social media pages for updates on upcoming actions and solidarity work. Second, we encourage you to keep an eye on the ceasefire tracker to see where your electeds stand on pushing for a ceasefire and where additional pressure is necessary. And I'd also recommend you check out Bay Rising at bayrising.org, which will have more links soon for more information on what's happening in your area. And third and finally, there will be a mobilization on President's Day for the Bay Area at 12 p.m. noon at the San Francisco Civic Center, which will include a march and rally. So stay tuned for more details over the next few days. And you can definitely find some of that information on AROC's event calendar. With that, thank you again for joining the Friday PSA. And to our ASL interpreters, thank you as well. And we'll see you in the streets.